Most women are taught to love with open hands and bleeding hearts, to bend and soften, and stay available even when it breaks them. But the woman who becomes emotionally untouchable, not guarded, not numb, but sovereign, she becomes something else entirely. She becomes unforgettable, because there is a difference between the woman who clings and the woman who contains. One seeks validation through closeness. The other holds a mirror to his void. And when a man looks into the eyes of a woman who no longer needs to be chosen, he doesn't see comfort. He sees truth, and it terrifies him. She is no longer playing by the rules he was raised to dominate, no longer soothing his insecurities with compliance, no longer sacrificing herself to be loved. She is warm, yes, kind, deeply, but untouchable because her emotions are no longer currency. They are compass. And the man, especially the one driven by conquest and control, begins to chase. But he doesn't realize it is not her he is chasing. It is the part of himself she awakens. The forgotten inner feminine, the anima that Jung so often spoke of. The force that calls him toward depth, toward wholeness, toward his own psychic rebirth. And that's where the war begins. He thinks she is withholding, that her silence is strategy, but it isn't. It's peace. It's the stillness that arises when a woman no longer ties her worth to being understood. When she has stopped trying to prove her softness. When she has nothing to offer but presence and expects nothing less in return. He reaches for her, but his hands are full of projections. He says she's cold, but what he really means is she no longer flinches when he withdraws. He says she's too distant, but what he cannot admit is she's no longer a slave to his attention. He says she's hard to read, but deep down, he knows exactly what she is saying. She will not collapse to be claimed. You see, when a woman steps into her emotional autonomy, she steps outside the game. She is no longer manageable, no longer intoxicating for the wrong reasons, no longer accessible to the kind of love that devours without nourishment. She is not cold, she is clear. And this clarity doesn't reject him, it reveals him, his patterns, his discomfort with depth, his desire to possess what he refuses to understand. Jung wrote that we fall in love not with the person, but with the projection of our own unconscious. She becomes that projection, not because she wants to be, but because he has not yet faced his own inner world. And so he chases her, not realizing that her mystery isn't performance, it's embodiment. She has done the work, faced the shadow, sat in the silence of her own abandonment, and found herself there. She no longer performs the fantasy. She no longer bleeds to be seen. And that is where her untouchable energy is born. She doesn't run. She just doesn't move for anyone unwilling to meet her at her depth. And this is what haunts him, because every other woman bent. Every other woman filled the space he left. Every other woman mistook his absence for a challenge, but not her. She doesn't chase. She doesn't explain. She simply withdraws her light. And that light, once taken for granted, becomes the very thing he aches for, not because it was his, but because it never was. He thought he was choosing her, but she was allowing him. And now, that allowance has expired. There's a kind of ache that only arises when a man realizes he has nothing left to manipulate. No hooks, no leverage, no emotional puppet strings. just her, standing still, whole, unreachable, unless he rises. This is not cruelty. It is invitation. She is not there to teach him with force. She is the mirror, and mirrors do not move, they reflect. What he sees in her now is not rejection. It is the absence of permission, the absence of the fantasy that once coddled his ego, the absence of emotional overexertion he used to feed on. Now, she stands, emotionally intact, soul anchored, no longer reactive, and therefore no longer available to his old self. She has become mythic, not because she's vanished, but because she is no longer willing to explain her worth. And he will chase her soul, not because she eludes him, but because he's never touched anything so real. There is a sacred power in a woman who has nothing left to prove. Her silence is no longer a wound. It is a boundary carved from self-respect. Her detachment is not bitterness. It is clarity forged in the fire of past betrayals. And her refusal to over-explain, to plead, to dramatize, that is not disinterest. It is the discipline of someone who has finally stopped handing her softness to those who confuse it for surrender. He sees this now, but it took her walking away from the battlefield, because only when a woman reclaims her soul from the ruins of emotional codependency does she become truly untouchable, not as armor, but as essence. Her stillness is not distance, it is depth. A depth that cannot be faked. A depth that cannot be rushed. A depth that requires initiation. And that initiation begins when the man realizes she no longer exists in his orbit. She is no longer orbiting his moods, waiting for him to show up emotionally, no longer shrinking to make him feel strong, no longer offering rehearsed understanding to a partner who was never listening. And now, her absence feels like gravity, the absence of drama, the absence of noise, the absence of anything he can control. And that is the torment. Because the feminine, when fully embodied, is not wild chaos. She is order beyond reason, not linear order, but spiritual coherence. She knows who she is, even when no one else does. And when a woman reaches this level of self-knowing, she becomes intoxicating to the unready, not because of what she gives, but because of what she no longer offers for free. This is the paradox that few men understand. The woman who makes herself emotionally available to everyone often loses her center. But the woman who holds her heart like sacred ground, whose emotions flow not on demand, but through trust and discernment, that woman draws desire that is no longer about possession, but transcendence. He doesn't know how to speak her language, not because she is foreign, but because she no longer speaks in emotional fragments. She speaks in full presence. She listens without needing to rescue. She offers love, but she does not abandon herself to give it. And that is what unnerves him. Because emotional untouchability is not aloofness. It is the quiet revolution of a woman who has witnessed her own pain and chosen to rise anyway, without asking anyone for permission. Now, he feels the absence of her overfunctioning, the space she once filled with empathy, with apologies, with emotional labor that was never reciprocated. And he begins to see it was never need that fueled her devotion. It was choice. She chose to stay. She chose to love. She chose to believe. And when she stopped choosing, everything he thought he controlled disappeared with her. This is not punishment. This is reflection. He is now forced to see what he brought to the table without her effort, holding the relationship together. And the truth is stark. It wasn't her coldness that kept him at arm's length. It was his inability to hold emotional gravity without collapsing into self-defense. It wasn't her independence that pushed him away. It was his refusal to meet her as an equal, rather than a project to fix or a trophy to win. Jung spoke of the feminine not as something soft and submissive, but as mystery itself, the gateway to the unconscious, the intuitive, the sacred chaos of the inner world. And the man who cannot hold that mystery will always reduce it to what he can predict, control, or label. But the woman who has met her own chaos, who has befriended the parts of herself she once hid, she no longer asks to be held. She holds herself, and that is what makes her emotionally untouchable. Not because she has walled herself off, but because she has nothing left to lose by being whole. Now, he sees her walking through the world differently, unbothered, alive, magnetic, and the more she resists being pulled back into the gravity of his projections, the more he reaches. But this time, there is no bait, no game, no invitation to repeat the past. She does not punish, she does not reward, she simply is. And in a world built on performance, a woman who simply is, who no longer distorts herself to be digestible, becomes the one thing he cannot stop thinking about. Because somewhere deep in his own forgotten shadow, he knows he was never chasing her. He was chasing the part of himself she refused to carry. There comes a moment in every man's path when the pursuit of a woman becomes less about conquest and more about confession. Not the kind spoken aloud, but the kind that simmers in the blood. A silent reckoning, a felt truth. And that truth is this: he is not chasing her because she ran. He is chasing her because she no longer participates in his illusion. He built a world where love was control, where emotion was a transaction, where vulnerability was weakness. And she, for a time, fit into that world, not because she was small, but because she loved him larger than his wounds deserved. She gave grace where he gave silence. She offered depth where he offered delay. But grace has limits, and depth demands reciprocity. Now, without her energy to mirror him, he sees the architecture of his relationships collapse. He mistook her composure for indifference, her softness for strategy. But the truth, she simply stopped negotiating her soul in exchange for crumbs of connection. He watches her now from afar, maybe not physically, but energetically. There's a presence to her that wasn't there before. Not louder, not more confident, quieter, more sovereign. The kind of presence that no longer seeks. The kind that selects. She no longer feels like someone to win. She feels like someone who reminds him of what he could be if he had the courage to face himself. But facing oneself is a ritual, and she has already gone through it. The ritual of shadow, of abandonment, of crying into the night with no one to save her, but the voice inside that said, "Not this time." The ritual of burning the version of herself that begged for love and rising from the ash as someone who now guards her own fire. So now, he reaches but finds nothing to grab onto. No emotional turbulence to manipulate. No unhealed need to hook into. She is whole, not because she doesn't feel, but because she no longer externalizes her worth. And that, to the unintegrated masculine, is unbearable. Because he was never taught how to feel without being needed. never taught how to exist without being the center, never taught that love isn't earned through control, but offered through presence, the very presence she begged for, again and again, until the begging became exhaustion, and the exhaustion became stillness, and the stillness became freedom. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And now, she lives that privilege. She is no longer driven by fear of abandonment. She welcomes it. If it means staying true to herself, she is no longer seduced by potential. She demands embodiment. She is no longer moved by apologies. She is moved by transformation. The more he tries to return to her with the same mask, the more invisible he becomes. Not because she hates him, not because she seeks revenge, but because she no longer resonates with the version of him that refused to evolve. And this is what torments him in the quiet moments. That her silence isn't rejection, it's reflection. The kind that stings because it asks nothing. The kind that pierces because it no longer bleeds. She has become a sacred echo, not a ghost, but a reminder of what he could have had, of what he refused to hold, of the version of himself that only ever existed in her eyes. And now, without that gaze, he is forced to face his own. He begins to realize that her untouchability was not the product of walls. It was the fruit of inner peace. And the irony, that kind of peace only comes after profound devastation. The kind he's now walking through. The kind he once dismissed when it lived in her. She went through the dark night of the soul and came out soft. Now he begins his, and if he's lucky, he too will come out changed. But she won't be waiting. She will be watching the sunrise from a higher place, not above him, but beyond the place they both once clung to. Because emotional untouchability isn't about distance. It's about elevation. She didn't disappear to hurt him. She disappeared to heal herself. And healing made her magnetic, not in body, but in energy. The kind of energy that cannot be seduced, cannot be chased, cannot be claimed, only met. She can only be met by a man who has entered himself, who has stood naked before the ruins of his own ego and chosen to rebuild not as a reaction, but as a revelation. She can only be met by the one who has tasted his own silence, held the weight of his own unworthiness, and chosen still to stay, to feel, to burn. Because a woman who is emotionally untouchable is not just free, she is initiated. She has walked through the sacred fire of heartbreak, not to harden, but to purify, to remember who she was before she forgot herself in someone else's storm. And now, her presence feels like thunder, wrapped in calm. She no longer tries to be understood by those who are unwilling to see. She speaks less because she means more. She gives less because she is more. And the man who once took her for granted begins to feel this absence like an ache in the bones. It's not her voice he misses. It's the reflection of truth he once saw in her presence. The subtle way she held space without begging for space in return. The way her emotions weren't weapons, but invitations. And how each time she was ignored, she withdrew a little more until she disappeared completely. Not out of spite, but out of alignment. This is the lesson he never saw coming. That love isn't about who stays longest. It's about who listens deepest. And he never listened. Not truly. Not beyond the words. not to the pause before she spoke, not to the quiet breaking in her eyes. He was waiting to respond, not to receive. Now, there is nothing to respond to. Her energy has exited the conversation. She no longer holds a place for him in her heart, not because she's closed, but because she's clear. He had a chance to meet her in her becoming, and he declined. And this is what Jung would call a missed initiation, a rejected summons from the unconscious, an avoided confrontation with the shadow. Because when a man refuses to meet the feminine with reverence, she doesn't punish, she vanishes into the sacred. He thinks she belongs to another now, but she belongs to no one. Not anymore. She belongs to the moonlight that bathes her when she walks alone at dusk. She belongs to the page of her journal, where her truths are held without judgment. She belongs to the dance of her own intuition, to the rituals she created in the silence he left behind. She belongs to herself, not as a possession, but as a prayer finally answered. And the man he now sits in the echo chamber of his choices. He replays conversations, rewrites endings in his mind, imagines the words he never said, the apologies he never made. But there is no doorway back, not because she holds a grudge, but because she no longer resides in the version of herself that tolerated him. She evolved, and evolution is a one-way door. What he never understood was that the emotionally untouchable woman is not without feeling, she is without illusion. And when a woman loses her illusions, she becomes unavailable to performance. He could once charm her with grand gestures, empty promises, momentary passion, but now, all of that passes through her like wind. She sees not just what a man offers, but where it's coming from. And if it does not come from depth, from integration, from truth, she does not move. Because she no longer needs to be chosen, she chooses. And if you are not rooted, if you are not present, if you are not whole, she will feel it before you even speak. Her body will register the dissonance. Her soul will reject what her trauma once accepted. Her nervous system will not ignite, and she will move on, quietly, elegantly, completely. This is not rejection. This is evolutional discernment. She is not asking to be worshipped. She is not asking to be adored. She is simply no longer willing to perform her own abandonment for the sake of being understood. And that is what makes her magnetic. To the unready, she is a storm. To the wounded, she is confusion. To the unconscious, she is threatening. But to the man who has done his work, who has walked through his own darkness and returned with the language of presence, to that man, she is home. But until then, she remains untouchable. He begins to realize what he never dared name. Before, it wasn't her distance that made her untouchable. It was her depth. She wasn't unreachable because she pulled away. She was unreachable because he refused to descend. And the descent is always the cost of intimacy into one's own shadow, into the unresolved grief, into the parts of self left behind in childhood, tucked away under performance, power, and pretense. She lived in those depths. And that's what made her so difficult to possess. She wasn't walking around on the surface, seeking validation. She was rooted in her inner world, and the only way to find her was to meet her there. But he never did. He hovered at the surface, afraid of drowning in what she had already made peace with. Her pain, her desires, Her unmet needs, she had already walked those corridors alone. So when he arrived, expecting her to dim, to beg, to collapse into him, she didn't. She stayed radiant. And that radiance grounded, still, unyielding. It was the most seductive and terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed, because he couldn't control it, couldn't provoke it, couldn't bend it to feed his ego. All he could do was stand there, exposed. That is the paradox of the emotionally untouchable woman. She demands nothing, but her being demands everything. Not with ultimatums, but with energy. She doesn't need you to make promises. She watches what your nervous system does in silence. She doesn't ask you to change. She simply reflects who you are and sees whether you rise or retreat. And this, for the man who lives in strategy, in charm, in emotional distance, is a nightmare. Not because she's cruel, but because she is impossible to lie to. Not because she'll catch the lie, but because your lie simply cannot reach her. When a woman no longer needs you to see her, because she sees herself, your gaze loses its power. When a woman no longer longs for your time, because she cherishes her solitude, your absence becomes irrelevant. When a woman no longer fights to be heard, because she's learned to speak only where she's received, your indifference becomes silence. He begins to feel the weight of that silence now, not just as loneliness, but as loss of access, not to her body, but to her energy, the energy that once soothed him, grounded him, lit up a room simply by entering it, the energy that once forgave him before he even asked, the energy that used to chase even when he pushed. And now she does not push, she does not pull, she simply exists beyond his reach. Not as punishment, but as protection. For herself. Because she has learned that being available to those who aren't emotionally safe is a betrayal of her nervous system. A betrayal of her healing. She no longer entertains chaos, disguised as passion. She no longer confuses chemistry with compatibility. She no longer thinks love is supposed to hurt. She has tasted peace, and now anything less tastes like poison. And for him, this is the great unraveling, because for the first time, he cannot negotiate with her emptiness. He cannot lure her with apologies, dipped in convenience. He cannot gesture toward healing without actually walking through it. If he wants her back, he must meet himself first. Not the version he shows the world, but the one he's hidden. The part that still flinches when asked to be seen. The part that resists softness because it was never safe to receive it. The part that only knows how to reach when something is already slipping away. Because now, it's already gone. And she is no longer looking over her shoulder. She is facing forward into a future where love is sacred, not performative. Where intimacy is built in silence and slowness, not urgency and adrenaline. Where presence is more powerful than promise. And he realizes she will never be touched by the same hands that once failed to feel her. Because the woman who becomes emotionally untouchable is not avoiding love. She's waiting for it to become real. He finally understands her emotional untouchability was never about withholding. It was about becoming so whole, so rooted in her own essence, that nothing outside of her, no man, no attention, no apology, could sway her from herself again. This kind of woman does not demand closure. She becomes it. She doesn't wait for healing to come from another. She builds it from the pieces she once gave away. She doesn't search for safety in the arms of someone who shattered her. She becomes a sanctuary unto herself. And that sanctuary, he cannot enter with old keys. Now he is on the outside, holding fragments of his own reflection, because what she offered him was more than affection. It was initiation, a sacred door to the parts of himself he never dared to explore. But he stood at the threshold and chose comfort. He chose delay. He chose the shallow over the sacred. And now she no longer opens the door. Because once a woman rises into full ownership of her emotional field, she cannot shrink back into survival love. The kind that requires her to beg for presence. The kind that turns her intuition into a liability. The kind that starves her soul while feeding his ego. She wants something else now, not perfection, but purity. Not in words, but in energetic integrity. She feels it before he speaks. She knows it before he performs. She doesn't need proof, she reads frequency. The man who stands before her must be coherent emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. Otherwise, he will feel her light, but never touch it. And this is where his longing turns to ache. He begins to see her not just as a woman he lost, but as a mirror he refused to face. He remembers how she used to ask questions that pierced, how she held space not just for his strengths, but for his fears, how she never asked him to be perfect, only to be present. But he didn't show up, not fully, not honestly. He wanted her love, but not the responsibility it required. He wanted her fire, but without the light it cast on his shadow. He wanted her soul, but not the depth of his own that she unearthed in the process. Now, she is no longer an option. She is a legend in his story. The woman who challenged him without needing to change him. The woman who saw his potential but refused to carry the weight of his delay. The woman who could have been his deepest mirror had he chosen to look. And what torments him most is not her absence. It's what she did with it. She didn't fold. She flourished. She didn't turn bitter. She turned inward. She didn't chase love, she became it. And now, she walks in a peace that he once called too much. A stillness that used to trigger him. A strength that once made him feel small, because he had not yet met his own. But now he wants that strength, not just to possess, but to understand. He wants to know what it feels like to be whole without validation, to speak truth without trembling, to hold space without escaping. And so, the chase becomes something else. No longer a pursuit of her body, her affection, her time, but a pursuit of the man he could have been, had he stayed. He begins to read the book she read. He sits with the feelings he once numbed. He starts asking questions, not about her, but about himself. This is not the romantic reunion he once imagined. This is the reconstruction of soul. Because now, he's not trying to win her back. He's trying to meet her where she left him. And perhaps one day, he will. Perhaps not to rekindle what once was, but to recognize the fire that she lit in him. The fire he never thanked her for. But whether he arrives or not, she does not wait. She moves forward slowly, gracefully, unapologetically, not away from love, but toward a higher frequency of it, not to prove anything, but to protect everything she had, to fight to reclaim. And in this motion, in this silent sovereignty, she becomes something rarer than desire. She becomes unchaseable, Because the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.